Hello, welcome back. In this video I'm going to talk about the Terran Eagle Raider. This ship has been quite the hot topic lately, especially in PvE circles. The console is very powerful for torpedo builds, but of course I'm talking about it in the context of PvP. I used this build in a match video that I uploaded a little while ago, and I think there's some ways to really improve this build. I definitely don't think it's perfect by any means. This is kind of just to give people ideas about maybe how they would build it or what they might do differently. And another thing is I'm not really the best at this kind of vapor style one-hit kill sort of gameplay. I'm more into the control and dogfighting aspect of it. So some of my choices kind of lean on staying in combat for longer. You could build the ship to be a lot faster in trade for being more fragile if you're kind of like a hit and run type player and that's your play style. So there's just a ton of potential. I mean, the ship has not only a very fast speed modifier, but a reasonably high hull capacity as well. And it's just perfect platform for those kind of builds. So I'll just jump right into the way that I had it set up, which was testing 5 forward torpedoes. This console that comes on the Eagle here, the covert warhead module, when it's equipped on a ship with full pilot seating, basically any ship that has pilot maneuvers, it lowers the shared torpedo recharge. So normally, like with beam weapons and cannons and that kind of thing, when you fire all your weapons, they all fire at basically the same time. There's not really a gap between them. But with torpedoes, there's usually a delay in between firing. I think that probably was programmed into the game way back, a decade ago. The idea is that like if a physical torpedo is going through a torpedo tube, you can't fire all multiple torpedoes at once or something like that. And I vaguely feel like I remember something from back then saying that the shared cooldown between torpedoes was 2 seconds. But that clearly is not the case. If you look at a lot of testing that's been done over on like STO builds, and I even went and tested this independently because I just couldn't quite believe that there wasn't a hard value there, but basically the shared cooldown between torpedoes is a lot shorter than we thought it was. So this 0.5 seconds shared torpedo recharge time, it's actually less than 0.5 seconds if you count it out, which is really interesting. So that's really cool console to use on a build like this. I'm actually using that console on another build, which I'm going to do a separate video about, but that's kind of the focal point of this build, is that this console makes it possible to then use a whole bunch of torpedoes. Now, whether using this many torpedoes is actually good or not is kind of up for debate. So let me just go through them. They're all pretty obvious ones. I have the enhanced biomolecular. This one deals a really huge singular hit. The quantum phase torpedo, a neutronic torpedo, and dark matter torpedo. These all fire under high yield multiple torpedoes. Like if I activate high yield and I hover over the tooltip, you can see it's like the quantum phase, 7,900 kinetic damage times 4, and the neutronic also times 4. Okay, so they all fire 4 torpedoes in this case, but I know there are some torpedoes in the game that fire 5 or 6. I don't have the Delphic torpedo on this character, but that would be another really good torpedo for this build. And basically this build is built around high yield torpedoes and trying to deal a really large amount of spike damage. This last torpedo here, the ultimate Kelvin torpedo, or you could use a standard Kelvin torpedo like off the exchange or whatever as well. The reason for this is that the flight speed of this torpedo, these Kelvin torpedoes, is faster than these other torpedoes. And some people in PvP use Strategist as their secondary specialization, which makes them immune to torpedo damage once per 45 seconds. So basically, like, if I fire a high-yield biomolecular torpedo and it hits someone with Strategist spec, they'll be immune to that hit. And that sucks, obviously, because you've invested this high yield shot, into a big torpedo, and then they're just completely immune to the damage. So my concept behind this was that by firing the ultimate torpedo, which then is basically guaranteed to hit first because of the flight speed, that means that the other 4 torpedoes here, which I actually intend to deal damage with, don't have to worry about immunities. And speaking of immunities, in my aft weapon slots, I'm using the kinetic cutting beam. I felt that kind of just went with the kinetic theme of this build, but probably any Omni would do just fine here. And that is mainly for people in their skill tree who are running the shield mastery skill point. Basically, it makes you immune to a critical hit every 20 seconds. So since the kinetic cutting beam is like a constant firing beam, it will trip that immunity before any of the torpedoes actually make it to the target, because the cutting beam is like an instant shot. There's no travel time. So these two things at the end on the right are basically just to trip those immunities and allow the actual torpedoes to land and deal damage. Otherwise, I have the colony deflector for the extra crit severity and all that, but the Jem'Hadar deflector is also a good choice. And then I'm running the 3-piece competitive set, same one I always run. I think that works really well. I mean, beam damage is still kind of king in PvP, even with some of the recent changes. And the bonus damage resistance that this offers is really, really good. But of course, you could be more aggressive and slot something like maybe the Mako set adds some torpedo damage, I think, or the 2-piece discovery set for hull regen. I mean, there's a lot of different options, really. The experimental weapon is the weapon that comes on the Eagle, the subspace depth charge. In my testing so far, this is parsed really, really well. Since it scales with aux power, and I'm a torpedo build anyway, I'm running my aux power really high along with my engine power. And that means that this is dealing pretty good damage to me. It does drain shields, but players replenish shields so quickly it's not really that useful. I'll talk a little bit about that further in the video. So moving on to consoles, in universal slot I have the bioneural infusion circuits. That's mostly for crit severity. I'm trying to land big critical hits with the torpedoes, obviously. The next 2 slots, it's subspace jumper, which teleports you behind your target and gives you some armor penetration with a really short 1-minute cooldown. And this is really like, I built most of this ship around using this console. That was kind of my idea, was kinetic damage with the subspace jumper. I thought that would be really fun. This console is basically free to get. You can get it off of, I forget which ship. It's some dilithium ship or whatever, so it's super cheap. Everyone should be able to grab this really easily if you want to try it. It's fun. Then I have Akara's Vengeance. That was an event console. It deals good electrical damage, and it's shield piercing, so it's just another kind of way to add to the spike damage. And speaking of that, I'll skip the science consoles for a second and talk about the tactical consoles. I have cascading subatomic disruptions and cascading gravimetric disruptions. And coupled with Akars here, those 3 consoles deal a pretty good amount of damage, electrical and kinetic respectively. Cascading gravimetric, if it hits shields, it's like firing a torpedo against shields. A lot of that damage is negated. So I always fire this subatomic one first to try to strip off shields. Subatomic works great against bare hull too, but basically these things are kind of to supplement spike damage as best I can. And then further down that line, I have the multi-dimensional wave function console. This is from the Tier 5 Vesta, which I grabbed with the T5 coupon that they gave away at the anniversary this year. This console, basically, it gives you some kinetic resistance and reflects kinetic damage back to the target. So this console is actually kind of the counter to a build like this that's based around kinetic damage so heavily. I don't think this console was all that effective when I tested it. The kinetic reflection is fun, but it creates this really huge purple bubble around your ship, like this. And you can kind of see on the edges here especially, it's very, very obvious when you're using this console. So anyone that sees you use this, they just, won't attack you for a few seconds while it's up, and then they don't have to worry about any reflection damage. So yeah, it saves you from some damage for 20 seconds. It has a short cooldown of 1 minute, but it's kind of debatable on just how effective that is. But something I still probably would carry around in my inventory if you have it, and you're going into a PvP match in case you come up against a torpedo vapor or something like that. Then I have Lorca's fire controls. This is a two-piece with the dark matter torpedo in the front, which helps with a little bit of extra crit severity. There's also some crit chance and shield penetration on the console itself. Although 157 shield penetration, it sure sounds like a lot, but it's really not. So it helps, but you know, there could probably be better choices in this slot. Like for example, you could slot the wide-angle dual beam bank up front and do the two-piece that way, and then it frees up a console slot for something else. I don't know. And then I have the weapon sensor enhancer. This is a Lobi console, and it's mainly here because I had a brain fart and forgot that I owned Hostile Acquisition, which would probably be even better here. That must be in my bank at the moment. But Hostile Acquisition also grants control and accuracy, but has an active ability that holds a target. So that might be a better console here if you use Hostile Acquisition to hold the target for a second before you fire your torpedoes, something like that. But the reason why I slotted this was I felt that the torpedoes were missing a little too often without it. Adding this, my accuracy is only 74. It's not really that high, but it still drastically improves the chances of my torpedoes hitting. And for those of you who don't know, high yield torpedoes and unbuffed torpedoes do not, they do miss pretty often. So that's something to keep in mind. But on the other hand, torpedo spreads never miss. So if you kind of redid this build, I think there's a couple of different ways that you could do this and make it a torpedo spread build instead. And if it were torpedo spread, you wouldn't have to worry about accuracy, and therefore you wouldn't need to slot this console. So there's an idea for you. All of my science consoles, I have the Eagle console here, of course, which is kind of making this whole build possible. The active ability on this, it's a short 15-second cloak. The destruction of area defenses thing, it doesn't seem to work all that well or consistently. And it does knock your shields offline just like the actual battle cloak. So you kind of have to be careful about when you use that active, but it does give you a bunch of defense and some flight speed, so there is some use case there. The next three consoles are all kind of on the defensive side. I have DPRM, which is a bonus damage resistance and hull regen thing. It also deals bonus damage when you have above 80% hull, but I never use it above 80% hull. It's always an emergency survivability clicky for me. Warp Burst Capacitor just teleports me and makes me a little bit harder to target for a second. And Elachi Jump is a phase-out ability, helps me get out of things like Parasitic Ice, and those Parliament bubble consoles and that kind of thing. So remaining slippery is important for staying alive, and especially in a ship like this, which is relatively fragile. Another option that I tried was I actually had replaced all of these tactical consoles except for Lorca's with these torpedo vulnerability exploiter consoles. These are pretty popular in PvE. They grant a not only a base torpedo damage increase, but also some crit severity. So if you're really focused on the torpedoes and you're just trying to deal maximum damage with them, then these work really, really well also. But I felt that having the cascading subatomic and gravimetric kind of one-shot thing was working well for me. But for example, if I didn't have these consoles, I probably would use like exploiters or something like that instead. And speaking of that, and I was going to talk about this when I talk about the bridge officer stations, but like I said, I don't think 5 torpedoes is actually optimal for this. It was fun for sure, but I think like putting the piezo beam array on here and then maybe beam overload somewhere. I mean, I'll just kind of skip ahead to the bridge officer stations and talk about that. So you have all this universal seating, which gives you so much to do. So for example, like this ensign universal seat, I could move this science team to some other seat, and I could put in a tactical officer here instead and slot beam overload 1. And beam overload 1 would activate the technical overload proc on this, which is a big electrical damage hit, and helps me cut through shields a little bit better. So that's an idea. Another thing, if I had beam overload 1 slotted, I also could use a duty officer like this guy. When you use beam overload, it has a chance to increase the shield penetration by 35%. Only for a few seconds, but 4 seconds is long enough that you might land a few torpedoes with more shield pen. So there's a couple of different ways to kind of work this build to fit your playstyle or ideas or whatever, and expand upon its spike damage potential, and there you go. So skipping ahead, I'm using Command as my primary spec and Pilot as my secondary spec. I think in the actual match I used Miracle Worker as my secondary spec, just for a little bit more defense, but I like the speed that Pilot offers. You get a little extra speed as you get hurt. And then Rock and Roll, of course, the little loop-de-loop thing. It's very funny, but you're immune during that time, so that's kind of cool. And my skill tree, I actually don't have any points in projectile training. This skill tree, don't look at this. It's not optimal for this build. This is for my dogfighter, of course, so I probably would modify it a little bit if I was going to be using torpedo builds often. And while I think they're really fun, it's not my personal playstyle, so I probably won't be doing all that much with it. Next up is traits. So my personal traits, I have a good day to die as a tactical captain. This allows me to get off a little bit more damage a little bit more often. And actually, as I say that, I'm noticing now that I forgot to put it on my bar this whole time. But go down fighting is the ability here. When you normally can only use this when you're below 50% hull, but with this trait you can use it at any time, and that's 50% bonus all damage whenever it's active, so that's really nice. I also have unconventional systems. I have a couple of unconventional systems procs that let me use my universal consoles more often. Then I have Terran targeting systems. This kind of leans on that crit severity thing. I'm not anywhere near 100% crit chance or anything like that, but I feel like dealing the really high damage crits is important on a build like this. Then I have Fresh from R&R that lets me use my team abilities more quickly. Both Science and Engineering team as well as Pilot team is on this build. Or if you ported this build over to like an Intel ship or something like that, this would obviously be critical to that. And then I have Give Your All. This dodges incoming damage. The dodge is applied before resistances, so it's actually quite a bit of incoming damage is reduced by this trait, but you could drop this and put something else that increases your damage. Maybe you could do like kinetic precision, an extra 10% projectile shield pen, or just go all out into like more projectile training, additional projectile damage. Intelligence Agent Attaché, this is pretty much on every build I use right now. Lets me use my attack pattern alpha faster, lets me use go down fighting faster, as well as all the other stuff, tactical fleet and fire on my mark, etc. I still have pseudo submission on here. This isn't as effective against other pilot ships now that Pilot team grants an immunity to this placate, but there are still plenty of people out there in Intel ships and other things like that, like control builds and science builds and that kind of thing. So being able to placate them occasionally does seem pretty useful. Reconstructive Radiation is a decent heal. It's only 12,000 basically, but it clears damage over time effects for me automatically, and there's so much radiation damage in PvP, I felt like this was pretty useful. And then kind of similar to Reconstructive is Secret Command Codes. Secret Command Codes gives me a little bit of healing as well as a resistance to various control effects, and a little bit of extra damage resistance. It's not a lot, but it all adds up. And then the last trait I'm using is Self-Modulating Fire. This, every 45 seconds, you get 10 seconds of 50% shield penetration, and that applies also to projectiles like all these lovely torpedoes. So, like I was saying before, if I'm using this kinetic cutting beam and I'm firing at someone and I'm critically hitting, it's stripping off their immunities to kinetic damage, and then immediately afterwards, because I've critted, my torpedoes get 50% shield penetration, so that's helping me deal a bit damage through heavily shielded targets, which is just about everyone at this point in PvP. And then keeping that same theme, my first starship trait is carrier wave shield hacking. This disables your target shields, and I'm just using tractor beam for this, and I'll talk about how I actually planned to use this build when I get to the end. But basically, I'm using this to knock someone's shields offline. The amount of time that their shields offline is not going to be 5 seconds in PvP. It is reduced by their subsystem repair skill. So like in the skill tree, I think it is this node, yeah, 50 resistance to the duration of subsystem offline effects. Almost everybody has chosen this because 10x your hull capacity is basically nothing. So a little bit of improvement to subsystem offline. That means that this trait, it's only knocking people's shields offline for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, not 5 seconds. But 2 or 3 seconds of no shields and then landing a couple of big torpedo hits is really beneficial. So that's why that's there. I also have Zal, of course, Invincible, and Invasive Maneuvers. I'm running both of those kind of defensively to try to stay alive. And similarly, to try to stay alive, Plot Armor is on this build as well. And then on a more offensive side of things, I have Assault Formation Theta. Whenever you use Attack Pattern Omega or Decloak, it grants you a high yield 3. So something that you can do, if you activate high yield 3 and then Omega, you'll actually see that I have 2 torpedo high yield 3s on my buff bar. That allows me to fire 2 torpedoes back to back with high yield. Or even better, if I'm cloaked, activate high yield 3, decloak, then hit Omega, you actually can fire 3 high yield 3s back to back. So that's a really, really good way to deal a lot of damage with multiple torpedoes. So that trait is fairly critical. Another really good one is the Alachi Cheshire Dreadnought. Has a similar trait. When you use high yield, it grants you a duplicate high yield. I don't actually have that trait, but if I did, I probably would try to use that as well. Another trait that I saw just a minute ago that reminded me actually is Piercing Projectiles from the Appalachia. Whenever you use a torpedo fire mode like high yield or spread or whatever, it grants you this additional hull and shield penetration. Now these values are, they look a lot better than they are. 200 shield penetration, that is 10% shield penetration. So it's not that much. You can actually go and check that by looking at the shield pen skill here. So like 100 shield penetration, it's only 5% additional bleed through. So that trait is not quite as effective as 200 would lead you to believe. That's 10% shield pen, and then 200 hull pen is, where is that? 20 extra armor pen. So the equivalent of negative 20 DRR to your enemy. So that's a good trait, definitely, but you probably need additional sources of shield penetration to get the best of it. Anyway, the last trait I'm using offensively is Advanced Precision Guided Munitions. Just rolls off the tongue there. This trait comes from the Cabot, which is like the command version of the Shran Escort. Basically, when you strike a target that has a shield facing below a certain amount, a pretty low amount actually, your next torpedo weapon deals additional kinetic damage. So not only do you have to hit an enemy shield down, you then have to also land a torpedo hit to get this additional kinetic damage. And I checked this on the Parse, and sometimes it hits really hard and it's awesome, and other times it basically doesn't hit at all and it's worthless. So it's kind of, I'm kind of up in the air about whether or not I like this one. Sometimes it seems to be really awesome and sometimes not, so I guess it depends. And the other thing is, like, if you heavily lean into shield penetration, then you don't really care about reducing their shields to a lower level. Like, if I could get a massive amount of shield penetration, then I definitely wouldn't use this trait because, you know, their shields would still be up, and therefore I wouldn't get this extra 25,000 kinetic damage from it. So one other option you could use is Temporal Surge. Temporal Surge, a lot of speed, a very short 2-second untargetability time. but also 100% crit chance, so you could use it offensively to land some big hits. Now, there is a bug that is very annoying. The Temporal Surge, I'll slot it here, you can see it on my bar. It's supposed to be cooled down when cloaked, but it appears to be bugged with Enhanced Battle Cloak. So a ship with Enhanced Battle Cloak, if I cloak, the cooldown of this ability does not improve. Or if it does improve, then it's like a tiny amount. And I think someone on my Discord timed this, and it was like 1 minute and 40 seconds or something instead of 2 minutes. It's still pretty bad. But if you're in a ship with a regular cloak, like not a battle cloak, then the cooldown, you can actually hit the minimum 40 seconds. So I don't know why it works differently between battle cloak or not battle cloak. But that's something to keep in mind if you are using this trait on a ship like this that doesn't have intel, because without intel, there's no other way to cool this down, and since you're stuck with the Enhanced Battle Cloak, you're not really getting the best out of this trait. It's still good, though. I mean, every 2 minutes, or 1 minute and 40 seconds, 100% crit chance. I mean, if you pretend it's just a universal console, then it's great. But it could be better if you could use it every 40 seconds or something, which I think is why probably like the Intel Talus is probably still a superior torpedo platform than this. I don't know. But moving on, in the space reputation area, I have a couple of constants. I always use these. Extra damage resistance. This is bonus damage resistance, so really, really useful. And crit severity. I'm also using counter stroke for an additional crit severity when controlled. If you find that you're not being controlled a lot, then you could ditch this and slot something else. Or you could go defensive and slot protomatter conduits, but one drawback to automated protomatter conduits, if you don't know, when you have this trait slotted and it's active, it will make you visible while you're cloaked. The visual effect makes it very obvious where you are. So don't run this if you're cloaking. And then the last trait, I have precision on here for additional crit chance, but I'm not actually sure if that's the best option. You could do like Omega Kinetic Shearing, which deals a little bit of extra damage as a damage over time from torpedoes. Or you could also slot the Discovery 1 torpedo pre-fire, or Terran 1, bonus torpedo damage. That's always good. And the last trait, Viral Engine Overload, this disables your target's engines on a critical hit, and kind of just plays that whole thing. I mean, basically if I can disable someone's engines and their shields for 3 seconds and land all these torpedoes, they're basically dead. The question, of course, is actually pulling that off, but I feel like this trait kind of helps contribute to that, so that's why I'm using it. Going to Bridge Officer Station, so there's a lot of universal seating on this ship, and it gives it a lot of flexibility. So I'm going to kind of talk about a couple of different ways I thought to run it. This is the way that I used it in the video. The tactical seat, I have Omega, which grants me that extra high yield as well as a lot of speed and bonus damage, and my own copy of High Yield 3. And then Chemosite Laced Weaponry, I put this on because it's a guaranteed hit with torpedoes, and I thought that the extra radiation damage and debuff would be helpful. I think in practice this didn't work as well as I thought it would, so maybe in this slot you could put something instead like Clean Getaway, or if you're struggling against Intel Team or something, you could put Lambda on, and then instead of Omega you could put Hold Together or Clean Getaway up in that command slot. There's a lot of potential for this seat, different ways to run it, so kind of experiment and see what works best for you. Another good one is Fly Her Apart. This got a pretty big buff. Not only does it increase your flight speed substantially, but also gives you some bonus damage, especially the Commander rank 1, which I don't actually have on this particular bridge officer, but it gives you a huge amount of flight speed, so you could use it offensively or defensively, to fly in with that extra bonus damage buff and land your torpedoes and then fly away really fast before anybody shoots you, that kind of thing. Maybe you could give up. I have plot armor here as a heal, but you could drop this and slot something else that deals more damage, piercing projectiles or whatever, and then just lean really heavily into speed and just try never to get caught, basically. In the ensign seat, though, I have pilot team. That's mostly for the immunity to placate. It's really useful, but also a little extra speed and clears those movement debuffs every 10 seconds. Let me jump over to the engineering seat. I'm using a lieutenant commander for that with emergency power to engines 3 to keep my speed up, auxiliary to structural integrity field for some resistance, healing, and the placate, which helps kind of keep the pressure off, and engineering team. This is totally critical. Engineering team not only clears an enemy's aux to sif placate, but it also clears like offline subsystem conditions. So in a build like this where you're really fragile, like if I lose my engines, I have to hit engineering team and get out of there, otherwise I'm going to get blasted. So, and the other lieutenant commander slot is shared with command. I have concentrate firepower 3, which helps recharge my torpedo shots, as well as grants 100% shield penetration kinetic damage from the torpedoes that I've already landed on the target. So this is a pretty good one. Photonic officer, I feel kind of naked without it, so I always slot that. And then I have 3 unconventional systems procs here. I have jam sensors, tractor beam, and scramble sensors. And jam sensors and scramble sensors really are just there purely to cool down my universal consoles, but tractor beam kind of coincides with the carrier wave shield hacking. That's how I'm taking people's shields down to land those torpedo hits. And I'll demonstrate that, how that's intended to work in a moment. The very last seat, though, is an ensign with a science team, and that science team is to clear off like subnucleonic beam or drain effects, that kind of thing. One other alternative that I kind of looked at doing was slotting torpedo spreads. So like, for example, I could slot entwined tactical matrices, which gives you free torpedo spreads whenever you use cannon, scatter volley, or fire at will, right? So it lets you back-to-back these torpedo spreads. So I could swap out this seat right here with another tactical, let's see, like this guy, and I could put in fire at will 1 and scatter volley 1, and then I would get some free torpedo spreads in between my shots. And those extra torpedo spreads, like I said before, they're guaranteed hits. So that's a pretty effective way to do it. I just lose improved cooldowns on these universal consoles that I'm using. So I probably would be more inclined to do something like that if I were using these locator consoles instead of universal consoles. That way I'm not as worried about cooling down my universal consoles faster. I'm just worried about torpedo damage exclusively, and that kind of leans into that. So there's a couple different ways to do that. One other one that what I kind of mentioned before was like using beam overload with the technical overload Pizio beam, just to add a little extra spike damage and shield penetration, that sort of thing. But for now, just sticking with the way that I had it set up. The duty officers, I have this officer that increases kinetic bonus damage. I don't think this is actually the best choice here. I would rather have 3 of these projectile officers that improve the recharge time of torpedoes. Because I'm trying to fire 5 torpedoes off. The faster I can get them off, the better. So having 3 of these type of officers would be probably better for this build. I just don't own 3 of them, and I didn't want to buy one. Then I have a con officer that helps recharge my evasive maneuvers for keeping my speed up. Aux Sif placate officer, of course, and the warp core engineer that clears debuffs. I mean, these 3, the con officer, placate, and warp core engineer, I pretty much never go without these days, so those probably aren't a surprise to anyone. So let me show you kind of how I intend for this to work. There's an enemy ship over here, and if I'm flying around, you'll see here on my bar, this tray 9 here, this is the subspace jumper console, and then immediately after that I have tractor beam, and there's a reason for that. When I hit my key, I'm going to click it just to make it a little easier, but when I hit my key, it will teleport me behind them, and then my tractor beam goes off and holds them, and see, my target shields are down, and that lets me fire my big torpedoes right into their back. So that's kind of the way that works. And obviously while I'm teleported behind them, I also have concentrate firepower, cascading subatomic, cascading gravimetric right after it. And see, I mean, that dealt a pretty big amount of damage, and I hadn't even fired my torpedoes yet. So basically I have all those right in a row. and the sort of intended use for this build, depending on how it's all going, is that I've got my high yield torpedo all buffed up here. I'm flying around, and I spot somebody that is a good target, and I fly within range and teleport behind them and shoot them in the back with a bunch of torpedoes. Like that. So when it works, it's awesome. When it doesn't work, you just got to keep trying. I mean, part of there's a lot of RNG that comes into play with PvP that's a bit different than PvE, because you have a thinking, reacting enemy. Like if that guy saw me coming, he might have hit something defensive, that makes me hard to shoot him or whatever. And so you just got to keep trying. If you try this and it doesn't work against one person, then you don't necessarily have to change your build. You could try it against someone in a different setting, or catch them off guard, or with the right timing, and kill them some other way or whatever. So that's kind of cool. And then I'm also going to talk about the parse really quick. This is the actual parse from the match that I uploaded, and this is my character here. If I look at the combat analysis reports, and one thing important whenever you're looking at a parse related to PvP is you basically should ignore this damage abilities thing and the main damage screen. What you want to do is go to this analysis report and click on damage 2. And this will show how much damage I actually dealt to enemy players. So these are the 5 players on the enemy team. Everything below this is just like a random pet or some crap that doesn't matter. So like I dealt 184,000 damage to this Jem'Hadar wingman, but does that actually matter? No. So looks like I mostly was shooting at Nokagar. I remember this ship, it was an engineering escort, so he had a lot of healing and was surviving really well, so he took a lot of hits from me. But you also can look at individual abilities in here. So like if I go to Cascading Subatomic, you can see that I had a 29,000 damage one hit against him with that ability. And one other thing about this parser is the shield damage column here. This also shows damage dealt to temporary hull. A lot of people have temporary hulls, so it's not like I'm dealing 69,000 damage just to shields. That's both shields and temporary hull are lumped into this column. I wish that you could see them separately, but you just can't. So, but like if we look at the different torpedoes, like I could kind of get a good idea of what torpedoes were working better here and against different players. Like the dark matter torpedo was awesome against this guy and really terrible against everybody else. So that's a question mark. Destruction of enemy area defenses, that's the console that comes on the Eagle. I really only got one good hit on a player. 36k, I mean, that is pretty good, but I barely even got it against anybody else. The biomolecular torpedo, let's see, I had a 109k one hit. That's pretty awesome. But then like these other hits are pretty bad. Chemosite-laced weaponry, that also didn't perform super well. Oh, right, what was the other one I wanted? Sympathetic detonation, that is from the, that's from this trait, the Cabot trait, advanced guided munitions. So that one, kind of small hits there, but when I got the 2x multiplier, that's pretty good. A 59k one hit. On a build that's centered mostly around kinetic spike damage, that is performing pretty well, I think. So there's definitely potential there. And then I also was using, I forgot to mention it, I guess, in this, but in that match I was using the Quantum Warhead module. That comes off of one of the Defiants, I think like the Tier 4 Defiant or something. So that's another console. It's cheap, it's easy to get. You could throw that on in one of these slots. And that console doesn't get cooled down by unconventional systems, so it's just, you get a charge every 20 seconds if you save up all 6 charges and fire them at once. I'm really conflicted on that console. I mean, 5 charges and it only did 7,900 damage, that's pretty bad. But then like, I'll look through some of these and see like, this one only 2 charges and it dealt 34,000, so I guess I just timed my buffs better, or my target was more debuffed or whatever when that went off, so it's just another thing in PvP that requires the right situation and the right timing. I mean, big surprise there. So, in my next video, I'm going to talk about kind of a similar kinetic style build, but on the Jem'Hadar escort, which I already uploaded a video using it. But either way, I hope that this kind of spurs some creative juices in everyone. There's definitely some potential for some cool torpedo builds. Some of the placate nerfs kind of helped out cannon builds. I mean, it's a pretty good time to be into PvP right now because there's just a lot of potential for different builds. You're seeing a lot of build variety out there that maybe we weren't seeing before, and I think that's really great. So either way, thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye.